Please share where you're watching from and consider subscribing to the channel. I'd been to Shiprock, New Mexico before, but never for anything like this. My friends there weren't just casual believers in the paranormal. They were the kind of people who carried salt and sage in their glove boxes, who could tell you which dirt roads were safe to walk at night and which ones you shouldn't even drive down in daylight. Most of them were Navajo, and they grew up with stories that outsiders like me only read about on the internet. We were having dinner at one of their houses, a kind of mini reunion. The night started lighthearted, old stories, drinks, joking about the things we used to get away with. But as the conversation shifted toward strange experiences, I finally said it. I want to go out and look for a skinwalker. Just once. For real. The laughter died down, and the room got that heavy stillness you only notice in hindsight. They glanced at each other. Most of them didn't even respond, just went back to their food. Except for one. "I'll take you," my friend Eli said. His voice was flat, no smile. But only once. The others shook their heads. One muttered, "You're insane." The next night, just before sunset, Eli pulled up in a battered pickup. His expression was unreadable, his eyes hidden under the brim of his cap. We drove for over an hour into the desert, the paved roads giving way to dirt, then to rough, rutted tracks where the headlights caught nothing but dust. By the time we stopped, the last traces of sunlight had been swallowed by the horizon. The darkness out there wasn't like the city. It was ancient, heavy, the kind of black that felt like it could press against your skin. Eli cut the engine. We just sat there for a while, listening. At first, it was the ordinary night sounds, wind moving over the sand, the dry rasp of insects, the occasional shuffle of something small in the brush. Then he started telling me about recent sightings, people hearing voices outside their windows at night that sounded exactly like a loved one, but hollow. Animals with human eyes. Shapes moving against the horizon in ways no person or creature should move. An hour passed. I thought maybe nothing would happen. Then Eli turned to me. "Get out of the truck." I laughed. "What? Get out. Walk a few feet ahead. Just listen." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. "You'll be fine," he said, but there was no conviction in his tone. "If anything happens, I'll hit the lights." I had a pistol on my hip, but I knew enough about skinwalker stories to know bullets wouldn't matter. Not unless they'd been blessed and dusted with white ash, which mine definitely weren't. Still, curiosity burned hotter than common sense. I opened the door, and the second I touched the handle, something changed. The night got heavier, denser. It was like the darkness had thickened into a presence. The temperature dropped fast enough that my skin prickled. And then, just as I was swinging my leg out, I realized something else. The desert was silent. The wind had stopped. The insects were gone. Even the faint hum in my ears from the quiet had vanished. That's when I heard it. A whistle. Not from outside. Not from somewhere distant. From inside the cab. It was close enough that I felt it in my ear, high and clear, a human-sounding whistle that didn't belong to either of us. I froze. My pulse spiked so fast it made me dizzy. I turned to Eli, ready to accuse him of screwing with me, but his face. All the blood had drained from it. His mouth hung open slightly, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the windshield. He wasn't breathing. "Eli!" I hissed, shaking his arm. He didn't blink. I shook him harder, and it was like breaking a spell. He gasped, blinked, then snapped into motion, starting the engine, flipping on the headlights, and killing the interior lights in one movement. We jumped out with flashlights. The beams cut across the sand, over rocks, into the scrub. Nothing. No footprints, no tracks, no movement. But the desert still felt occupied. Eli's jaw was tight. "We're leaving." When a Navajo man who spent his whole life around this kind of thing tells you to leave, you don't argue. The next night, he invited me out again, but not for a skinwalker hunt. "Bigfoot," he said. "Safer." We hiked into a different part of the desert, near Shiprock Mountain itself. The terrain was rough, scattered with boulders, the air dry and sharp. Eli had 2 other guys with him this time. This area had a history, multiple sightings over decades. Some hikers had reported nests or resting spots with piles of bones. I thought it sounded like campfire exaggeration until we found one. It was a clearing under a twisted, low-hanging tree. The ground was scraped bare, the dirt packed down, and the smell hit before I saw them. Bones. Dozens of them. Deer mostly. Some cracked open, marrow sucked clean. We crouched down, inspecting the area. That's when we heard the first sound. A yelp. Not high and sharp like a coyote, but deep, almost feline, but wrong. Eli's flashlight snapped up toward the ridge above us. I didn't see anything, but the other two swore they saw movement, a massive, upright silhouette slipping behind a rock. We didn't have time to talk about it, because the footsteps started. They came from all around us, circling. Every time we spun in one direction, the sound shifted to another, just out of the flashlight beams. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't even cautious. It was confident, and it was closing in. We stood back to back, lights sweeping, breath visible in the cooling air. The space between the trees seemed to tighten, the dark pulling in on us. Then something big moved through the brush just beyond the treeline, snapping branches like toothpicks. I caught the briefest glimpse, tall, wide-shouldered, with eyes that reflected not like an animal's but with an odd, amber sheen, like light bouncing off glass. Eli didn't wait. "We're done. Move." We hiked out fast, no one talking, the darkness at our backs feeling thicker with every step. That night in my motel room, I lay awake replaying the whistle in my head. The way it had been right there, close enough to feel on my skin. And I realized, whatever had whistled to me in that truck hadn't needed to be outside. It was already inside. 2 summers ago feels like a lifetime now, but I still can't think about that trip without my skin crawling. It was supposed to be my first real wilderness adventure, 25 miles into the backcountry of the Grand Tetons with my boyfriend at the time, Harry. He wasn't just some guy who liked to camp. Harry had been in the military, could start a fire in a downpour, and talked about land navigation like other people talk about weekend barbecues. He'd been trying for months to convince me to join him on one of his real treks, the kind where you disappear from civilization for days and carry everything on your back. I finally caved. The morning we set out, he looked like something out of a survivalist catalog, machete on one side, fixed blade knife on the other, bear spray clipped where he could grab it without looking. Me? I had new boots I was still breaking in, and a 40-pound pack that already felt like a personal enemy. The first mile was uphill hell. My thighs burned, my lungs screamed, and I was sweating through my shirt before we even reached the first bend. You're supposed to make noise in grizzly territory, so you don't accidentally surprise one, but we were too out of breath for conversation. The only sound was the stream to our left, tumbling fast over stones, and the crunch of our boots on the trail. About an hour in, the climb eased and the trees thinned just enough for me to catch my breath. That's when I noticed it, the silence. Not just quieter than before, completely silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears strain and your body go rigid without you realizing it. No birdsong, no wind, not even the faint hum of insects. Harry noticed too. He gave me a look, one I'd come to learn meant something's wrong, without saying a word. I was a few paces ahead when I crested a small rise and froze. 10 feet in front of me, right in the middle of the trail, sat a grizzly. It was massive, bigger than any bear I'd seen in a zoo, muscles rolling under its fur as it shifted its weight. Its head was down, sniffing at something on the ground. I couldn't speak. I just flung one arm behind me like a semaphore signal, trying to get Harry's attention without making a sound. When he saw it, he reacted instantly, pulling me behind him in one smooth motion and stepping forward with his voice booming like a drill sergeant. He didn't just yell, he bellowed, the kind of roar that rattles in your ribcage. The bear stood, towering over us for a split second before dropping to all fours and taking a few deliberate steps our way. My heart was in my throat. Then, from the forest to our right, came a sound, a sharp crack of a branch snapping under weight. The bear's head whipped toward it, ears flat, and it froze. Another crack followed, closer this time, and then the grizzly did something I didn't expect. It turned and bolted down toward the stream, crashing through the brush like something had scared it half to death. Harry muttered something about falling branches, but I could hear the tension in his voice. Bears don't just run from random noises. We kept moving, faster now, putting distance between us and whatever had spooked the bear. I kept glancing over my shoulder. That's when Harry stopped dead. Down the slope behind us, through the lattice of tree trunks, something moved. At first, I thought it was another bear, dark, shaggy, broad-shouldered. But as it turned, my stomach dropped. It was too big, at least 3 times the size of the grizzly we'd just seen. And when it straightened up, it didn't move like a bear at all. It stood upright, peeling itself out of the shadows, and its arms, too long, too thin, hung like pendulums at its sides. We didn't talk about it. We ran. The sound of its pursuit followed us for what felt like miles. Heavy footfalls pounding the earth in rhythm with our own, closing the distance and then falling back like it was toying with us. Every instinct screamed at me not to look back, as if eye contact would seal whatever fate it had in mind. Eventually, the footsteps faded. My legs were shaking, my lungs burning. Harry tried to calm me down, telling me bears almost never act that way, but even he didn't believe his own words. We hiked for another hour before finding a small clearing where the ground leveled out. Harry decided we should rest and eat something. My stomach was in knots, but I forced down a protein bar, scanning the trees constantly. That's when a second bear showed up, a younger grizzly, smaller but tense, eyes darting like it was being chased. Harry leapt to his feet, charging toward it with bear spray in one hand, and the other waving wildly over his head. The bear didn't hesitate. It bolted into the underbrush and was gone. I wanted to scream. What was happening here? Why were bears acting like something was hunting them? Later, we passed the point where a park ranger was supposed to have checked in earlier that day. The prints from his horse were there, but no sign of him. We hadn't seen another human being since the trailhead. By late afternoon, I developed a hot, stabbing pain in my right foot. We stopped to tape it up, losing almost an hour of daylight. By the time we started hiking again, dusk was falling fast, shadows stretching long between the trees. We still hadn't reached our intended campsite when night swallowed the forest. My headlamp flickered and died, dead batteries I swore had been fresh. Harry's was the only working light, its narrow beam carving out a tunnel in the dark. The wind picked up, rattling the branches overhead and drowning our voices. It was nearly 9 p.m. when we stumbled on a strange clearing, shaped like a bowl, about 200 meters wide, with half the trees inside dead or rotting. Outside the bowl, the forest was lush and green. Harry decided we'd camp there. To lighten the mood, he set his small speaker on a rock and played music. But the sound didn't echo the way it should have. Instead, it warped, stretching and bending, as if the air itself was twisting it. Then the wind stopped, and the music cut out. The silence was sudden and absolute. We crawled into the tent. I just started to drift when the first thud hit, deep and resonant, like something heavy landing on the forest floor just beyond the treeline. Another thud followed, closer this time. Something scraped against the nylon wall of the tent. Slowly, deliberately, a long dent formed where the pressure dragged down, as if a finger or claw was tracing the shape of the tent. "What is it?" I whispered. "I don't know," Harry breathed. His voice was low but tight, every syllable taut with control. "It's not a person. We're alone out here." Then the side of the tent pushed inward. Not a poke, something leaned its weight into it, the fabric bowing toward me until I could see the outline of a face pressed to it. A nose, an open mouth. The breath moved the material in and out with slow, steady pulls. Harry's voice was sharp now. "Screw this." He reached into his sleeping bag, pulled out his Glock, and racked it loudly. The sound was like a thunderclap in the dead stillness. The face vanished. Footsteps thundered away through the clearing. We didn't sleep. We didn't unzip the tent until sunlight cut through the seams. When we stepped out, the first thing we smelled was urine, sharp and acrid, coming from the cold fire pit. The coals were still warm, steam rising in the morning chill. And then we saw them. Footprints. Dozens of them. Bare. Human-sized. Circling the tent. Handprints smeared in mud across the nylon walls. We packed up in silence. I must have been 5, maybe 6 years old when it happened. At that age, your whole world is only as big as what you can see, and your parents are the people who make it feel safe. That trip was supposed to be one of those perfect family vacations, something my parents would talk about for years, something I'd remember in warm, golden snapshots. We were headed into the mountains of Utah, up a road that seemed to twist forever, climbing higher and higher until the world below disappeared into a blur of pine and rock. My dad kept the windows cracked so the cold air could sweep through the car, carrying that sharp scent of altitude, like stone, sap, and something old. When we finally reached the top, it felt like the end of the earth. The road opened into a little clearing, and there, cradled between jagged ridges and dense stands of pine, was a mountain lake. The water was still enough to reflect the sky like glass, and the silence around it was so complete you could almost hear your own heartbeat. We set up camp on a strip of rocky shore. My grandparents had come along, as well as my uncle and my older brother. The tents were pitched just above the waterline, close enough to hear the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. My brother and I spent the afternoon throwing pebbles into the water and daring each other to wade in, but the chill stopped us at the knees. As the sun slid toward the mountains, the air turned from crisp to cold. The adults built a fire, its smoke curling into the darkening sky. I was sitting on the shore with my dad and uncle, holding a fishing pole far too big for my hands, pretending I was going to catch the biggest fish in the lake. It was my dad who saw it first. He squinted across the water, frowning slightly. "What the hell?" he muttered. I followed his gaze. On the opposite shore, maybe 100 yards away, something was standing. It was huge. Even from that distance, I could tell it was far taller than any man I'd ever seen. 8 feet, maybe more. Its body was covered in dark, shaggy hair that shifted in the breeze, and it stood upright, shoulders squared, as still as a carved statue. My first thought was that it might be a person in some kind of costume. We'd seen hunters wearing camouflage that blended almost perfectly with the trees, so why not something weirder? But this wasn't camo. This was alive. Then it made a sound. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't like any animal call I'd ever heard. It was high and sharp at first, then dropped into a garbled, almost rhythmic series of sounds, like a language, but not one I knew. It had inflection, a kind of rise and fall, as if it were speaking. My dad and uncle froze. My mom, curious, walked down from the campsite to see what we were staring at. My grandparents followed, even my brother trailing behind them. Our dog, usually a yapping, fearless mutt, went rigid beside me, hackles raised, staring across the lake without making a sound. For reasons I'll never understand, my dad decided to mimic it. He cupped his hands to his mouth and tried to reproduce the strange sequence of sounds. The thing on the shore answered. A burst of those same bizarre syllables carried across the water. Then my dad did it again. Back and forth they went, call and response, like some surreal game of telephone with an 8-foot stranger. The whole family stood there watching. No one laughed. No one spoke. It was like the moment had locked us all into place. Then, without warning, the thing moved. It turned, still upright, and bolted into the forest with a speed that didn't make sense. My dad later said it had to have been running 25, maybe 30 miles per hour. And the way it moved smooth with long, fluid strides wasn't like anything human. My brother and grandfather did what I now realize was the stupidest thing they could have done. They chased it. They sprinted around the curve of the lake, our dog bounding after them, barking wildly now. I stayed where I was, gripping my fishing pole like it was going to help. My mom kept a hand on my shoulder, eyes fixed on the far tree-line. When they came back, they were empty-handed except for one thing. Clutched in my grandfather's fist was a clump of long, coarse, black hair. They said they'd found it snagged on a stretch of old barbed wire, right where the creature had disappeared into the woods. The hair was unlike anything I'd ever touched, thick, almost wiry, and smelling faintly of earth and something musky. My grandfather said it could have been from a bear. My dad disagreed. We should have packed up and left right then. But we didn't. That night, the wind came down off the ridges in long, hollow gusts, rattling the tents. None of us slept well. Every time a branch snapped or the fire popped, I'd lie there in the dark, picturing that massive figure on the shore. I wondered if it was still out there, listening for the sound of my dad's voice. In the morning, the lake was glassy again, the opposite shore empty, as if nothing had ever stood there. My grandparents downplayed it over breakfast, but my dad stayed quiet, staring out over the water. Sometimes, when I think back on it, I remember the strangest part wasn't the size of the thing or even the sound it made. It was how deliberate it all felt, like it had wanted us to see it, like it had been trying to talk to us. And I still wonder what would have happened if my dad had understood the words. I was 14 the summer it happened, old enough to think I was invincible, but still dumb enough to take unnecessary risks just because I thought they made me look brave. My family had driven deep into the Rocky Mountains for a week-long camping trip, the kind where there's no cell service and the nearest grocery store is an hour away. We'd set up on the edge of a pine-thick valley, close to a glacier-fed river that ran so cold it hurt to dip your hand in for more than a few seconds. The first 2 days were pure summer freedom, swimming in the shallows, roasting hot dogs over the fire, pretending to help my parents with camp chores, but mostly just messing around with my best friend Adam, who'd been allowed to come along. We had our own tent, pitched a little downhill from the main campsite, which meant we could stay up late whispering and playing cards without the adults telling us to quiet down. By the third night, we were restless. The novelty of esmores and ghost stories had worn off, and we were itching to explore. We'd noticed a narrow game trail branching off from the main path earlier that day, snaking up into the thicker part of the forest. Adam had been on me about checking it out after dark, just to see how far we could go before it got too spooky. Around 3 a.m., After everyone else had been asleep for hours, we slipped out of our tent. The air was razor cold, the kind that seeps through your clothes and settles against your skin. We didn't bring much, just flashlights and the naive confidence of teenagers who believed nothing could happen to them. We crept past the banked coals of the campfire and headed toward the trail, our boots crunching softly on the packed dirt. The forest closed in around us almost immediately. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy, leaving us in a dim, shifting gloom. My flashlight beam cut a narrow tunnel ahead of me, dust motes floating lazily through the light. At first, it was just the thrill of breaking the rules, being out here when everyone else was sleeping, knowing that our parents would be furious if they caught us. We joked about bears and mountain lions, each trying to outdo the other with increasingly ridiculous scenarios. But as we got deeper, the air seemed to change. It's hard to describe exactly, but it felt heavier. Not just colder, but thicker, as if the air itself had weight. The smell of pine and damp earth was joined by something else, an acrid, metallic tang that made the back of my throat itch. About 20 minutes in, I started to feel uneasy. The trail had narrowed, hemmed in by gnarled branches that tangled above our heads like skeletal fingers. My flashlight flickered, just once, but enough to send a quick spike of adrenaline through me. "Hey," I whispered, "maybe we should turn back. It's colder now," and I hesitated. I didn't want to admit I was spooked. Adam smirked, nudging my shoulder. "Come on, man. We barely started. Don't tell me you're scared already." Against my better judgment, I followed. Another 10 minutes passed. The silence grew oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our boots. Then, as my flashlight swept across a small clearing, I froze. Something was standing there. It was tall, easily 7 feet, but impossibly thin. Its legs were too long, its body stretched and wrong, like a shadow that had learned to stand upright. And it had no arms. I remember the way my breath hitched, the small puff of vapor hanging in front of my face. I kept the beam on it, my mind scrambling to explain it away. Maybe it was a tree stump or a trick of the light. But the shape was too defined, the stance too deliberate. "Adam," I whispered harshly, my fingers gripping his sleeve. "Do you see that?" He followed my gaze. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then it shifted. Not a step, not a lunge. Just this slow, unnatural tilt of its head, or what I thought was its head, like it was acknowledging us. My body reacted before my brain did. I bolted. Branches clawed at my arms and tore at my jacket as I crashed back down the trail. Adam was right behind me, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the dark. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop until the flicker of our campfire came into view. We didn't even try to get back into our tent. We dove straight into my parents' tent, breathless and shaking, waking them with our sudden entrance. My mom started to scold us, but the look on my face must have stopped her. She asked what happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. For the rest of the trip, Adam and I refused to be alone after dark. Even walking to the latrine was a group activity. We never told the adults the full story. They wouldn't have believed us anyway. It was late, maybe around 11:30, when my boyfriend and I were leaving his house. Nothing unusual, just another night saying goodbye to his family, petting the dogs one last time before we hit the road. I mention the dogs because it matters. His 3, Mac, Baby, and Sandy, were all accounted for. Mac was inside with his parents, Baby and Sandy were in the yard, and we'd both scratched their heads before heading to the car. He lives on a private road, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and any unfamiliar face or animal gets noticed fast. People talk. If a stray dog wanders in, it's the next morning's coffee gossip. Which is why when we pulled out of his driveway and I saw those eyes, I knew something was off. They were maybe 50 feet ahead of us, low to the ground but glowing a hard, unnatural yellow in the beam of the headlights. My first thought was a rabbit, maybe a stray cat, something small. But the eyes didn't match the size I expected. Too far apart. Too steady. My boyfriend slowed the car. The dogs in the yard were already staring in that direction, heads tilted, ears forward. Then the thing stepped into the open, and my stomach went cold. It was bigger than a house cat, but too small for a deer. Its coat, or what looked like a coat, was slick and black, almost oily, catching the light in a way that didn't seem natural. The shape was wrong. Its shoulders seemed too high, its body hunched in a way that looked uncomfortable, like its joints didn't quite work the way they were supposed to. Instead of bolting from the light like any normal animal, it moved toward us. Slowly. It took a few steps, then sat down. Just sat. Then it got up again, walked a few more steps, and sat down once more. It did this over and over, like it was sizing us up, closing the distance in increments. At first I thought it was moving on 4 legs, but then I realized I couldn't tell for sure. Sometimes it looked like it was using its back legs. My boyfriend swears it stayed low the whole time, but I saw moments where its posture was more upright, like it was switching between ways of moving. We both felt it at the same time, that heavy prickling sensation that something is very, very wrong. Without speaking, we decided to get the hell out of there. He pressed the gas, and we didn't look back. The whole reason we'd even gone to his place that night was because he was supposed to stay over at mine and had forgotten his clothes. I'd driven to pick him up, which meant when we'd left my house earlier, I'd left the front gate open. My grandparents live with me, and they're both disabled. If the gate was open in the morning, they'd probably just assume I'd forgotten to close it. Not ideal, but not the end of the world. When we finally pulled into my driveway, the headlights swept over the gate. It was closed. Neither of us had touched it. My grandparents were asleep hours before we'd left. There's no one else who would have been out there, and certainly not at this time of night. That was when the unease from earlier came roaring back. I put the car in reverse without thinking and drove right back out. We ended up sitting in a grocery store parking lot for 20 minutes, both of us trying to come up with any explanation that didn't make us sound insane. There's no conclusion to it, not a neat one. We didn't go back to check the yard. We didn't see the creature again. But that image, those glowing yellow eyes, the twisted, too fluid way it moved, has stayed with me. When I was growing up, my grandfather wasn't the kind of man who'd waste breath on stories he didn't believe. He wasn't cold about it, just practical. He'd listen to ghost tales, Bigfoot sightings, alien abductions, and then he'd say, "Neat story," in that polite but dismissive way of his, and move on to talking about the weather. So the night he sat down at our kitchen table and told me about Sir Scotch, I knew it wasn't just a story. He leaned in, voice low, the way people do when they're not sure they want to say something out loud. "This was back in the 70s, he began. "I went up into the Cascades to visit an old friend of mine. Name was Harold, but everyone in those hills just called him the Hermit. Harold's cabin was something out of a photograph you might find in a history book. Built high on stilts, perched on the edge of a steep slope, it looked like it had been trying to stay above something for decades. The stilts lifted the cabin 10 feet off the ground, and there was a balcony wrapping around the front, jetting out into open air. Here's the part that always stuck with me. There was no way up to that balcony. No stairs, no ladder, no rope. Just sheer drop on all sides. Place always felt odd, Grandpa said, pausing to sip his coffee. Like the woods were watching you back. They'd spent the day hunting, trekking through thick brush in the damp mountain air. By the time they made it back to the cabin, the light was fading and a heavy stillness had settled in the trees. Inside, Harold lit a single oil lamp. The room wasn't much bigger than a small studio apartment, just enough for a cot, a table, and a wood stove. As they sat, Harold looked at him and said, almost casually, "Sir Scotch is in the woods tonight. You best be careful if you're out after dark." Grandpa laughed, thinking it was some local in-joke. But Harold didn't laugh back. Without another word, Harold began gathering food, fruit, stale bread, strips of homemade jerky, and arranging it neatly in a wooden bowl. He stepped outside onto the balcony and placed the bowl right on the edge, balancing it above the empty space below. "It'll be gone by morning," Harold said flatly. The night came in heavy after that. The air in the cabin seemed thicker, carrying the resin-sweet scent of the pines and the faint smoke from the wood stove. Grandpa lay in a cot by the single window, facing the balcony, while Harold rolled into his bed on the other side of the room. Hours passed. The forest outside was a deep, unmoving shadow, the kind that swallows even the memory of daylight. Then, sometime after midnight, Grandpa woke to a sound. At first it was just a faint rustle, almost like the wind brushing against leaves. But there was no wind. The sound came again, closer this time. Something large was moving in the dark, and it was moving with the kind of care that meant it didn't want to be heard. Then he saw it. A hand, if you could call it that, emerged into the weak moonlight spilling across the balcony. For thick fingers, longer than any human's, curled over the edge of the railing. They were covered in coarse, dark hair, and each finger was as wide as a broom handle. They didn't grab the bowl. They just rested there for a moment, massive and deliberate. Grandpa held his breath, every instinct telling him to move, but his body refused. He felt the weight of something unseen just beyond the rail, its presence pressing into the cabin like a tide. Then the fingers slipped away. The forest went silent again. When Grandpa woke in the morning, the bowl was empty. No crumbs, no scraps. Just the faint mark of where it had sat on the wood. Harold didn't mention it. He made coffee like it was any other day. Grandpa finally said, "That was no bear last night." Harold just nodded once. Never said it was. Grandpa didn't press him. He packed his gear, thanked his friend, and drove back down the mountain. He never hunted in those woods again. That was 40 years ago, but when he told me the story, his voice still carried that tight edge, like a man who'd seen something he couldn't explain, but couldn't stop thinking about either. The way he described those fingers has stuck with me more than anything else. Massive, inhuman, resting there like they had all the time in the world. And I sometimes wonder, if he'd moved, if he'd stood up, if he'd stepped outside, what Sir Scotch would have done next. I moved to Vermont in early 2018, worn down from weeks of packing, a long drive, and the kind of stress that seeps into your muscles. The place I'd found wasn't supposed to be permanent, just a stopover while I waited for the house I'd bought to close. Online, the photos made it look like something out of a rustic bed and breakfast listing. In reality, it was far more remote than I'd expected. It sat at the very end of a twisting dirt road that barely saw any traffic. If 10 cars passed in a day, that was considered busy. The surrounding land was postcard pretty in a way that almost made you forget how alone you were. Wide lawns rolling into rough pasture, all ringed by towering pine and birch. Out front was a pond frozen solid under the March cold. In the back, a massive apple tree still held a few shriveled fruits from the fall, their skins wrinkled and dark. For feet of snow covered everything, muffling the world in white. I had my old dog with me, already 17 and moving slower than he used to, and my cat, who was perfectly content to watch life from a windowsill. The dog had been with me through more of my life than I liked to admit. He didn't roam much anymore, but I still kept him leashed outside. Not for predators, though those were around, but because the neighbors down the hill kept alpacas that apparently hated dogs with a passion. I'd been told to never let him wander near them. The idea was funny at first, until I pictured him being kicked by one of those long legs. The house was simple, a single story with motion sensor lights above the driveway that clicked on whenever something passed. About 30 feet from the kitchen was an open-sided outbuilding, something between a shed and a garage, filled with rusted garden tools, warped lumber, and dusty storage bins. Off the kitchen, a screened-in porch looked out over the frozen pond. When I first arrived, I thought it would be a great spot to have morning coffee. Later, I realized it made the place feel just a little less exposed. On my second night there, I locked myself out. It was around 8 o'clock, dark enough that the sky above the treeline was nothing but a smear of stars. I'd stepped out to let the dog do his final round for the night. I wasn't exactly dressed for it, nightgown, sneakers, and a jacket barely thick enough for March. I figured we'd be out for 5 minutes, tops. We stayed in the plowed section of the driveway. My breath hung in the air, the snow underfoot squeaking in that sharp, cold way. When we turned back toward the house, I reached for the kitchen door and felt my stomach drop. It was locked. I must have let it shut behind me without thinking. My phone was inside, my car was locked, and the cold was already seeping into my fingers. For a few seconds I just stood there, staring at the door, trying to convince myself there had to be a simple fix. Then I remembered the outbuilding. I'd seen a crowbar leaning against the wall earlier in the day. If I could get to it, I could smash a window and climb in. I tied the dog's leash to the side mirror of my car and trudged through the snow to the shed. The crowbar was freezing cold in my hands, the metal biting into my skin. I hurried back to the kitchen window, took a deep breath, and swung hard. The metal hit the glass and bounced off with a jarring clang that sent a shock up my arms. No crack, no shatter, bulletproof glass. In a rental house. I tried another window, same thing. By now my hands were stiff, my teeth chattering. That was when the dog started barking. It wasn't his usual bark. This was loud, sharp, and deep, the kind of sound that made your chest tighten. His voice carried across the slope behind the house, echoing until it almost sounded like there were other dogs answering him. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the barking. I called his name, my voice sharp in the cold air. No sound, no movement. I didn't have time to stand there and panic. The screened porch was my last hope. I remembered seeing that the porch door didn't lock, which meant the inner kitchen door might still be open. The only problem was getting to it. The snow in that direction was untouched, deep enough to swallow my legs. I found a shovel in the outbuilding and started digging a narrow trench toward the porch door, my sneakers filling with ice water as I moved. Every so often I shouted for the dog, trying to convince myself that he'd simply walked out of sight. The only answer was the crunch of my own steps. By the time I reached the porch and yanked open the screen door, my hands were shaking from the cold. The inner door was unlocked. I bolted inside, dropped the crowbar on the counter, and ran back out to the car. The leash was hanging loose, the end torn straight through. Not frayed, not chewed, torn. My pulse was in my throat when I saw him coming from around the back of the house, moving slow and steady, tail wagging like nothing had happened. I knelt to check him over. No blood, no limping. Just a strange smell clinging to his fur, something earthy and faintly metallic. I got him inside, locked the door, and didn't think about it again until the next night. That's when the knocking started. It was clear and deliberate, 2 solid raps, one from the right side of the house, the other from the left, like someone testing the walls. I froze in the kitchen, every nerve in my body straining to listen. No wind, no animals, just cold stillness. The next night I was ready. I had my flashlight in one hand, my ski pole in the other for balance on the ice, and the house keys zipped into my pocket. I walked the dog quickly, sticking close to the porch light's glow. That's when I saw them. Just beyond the low stone wall where the lawn gave way to forest, a pair of eyes were watching me. They were far apart, too wide for a deer, and glowed a deep reddish-orange in the light. Not the quick, reflective flash you get from an animal's eyes in headlights. These burned steady, like coals in a fire. I shifted left. The eyes followed. I shifted right. They tracked me. My breath came fast in the cold. I kept walking backward toward the porch, my flashlight locked on the tree-lean, the dog pressed against my leg. When I reached the door, the eyes blinked once and vanished into the dark. The next morning, I went back out with binoculars, scanning the spot where I'd seen them. No tracks, no crushed snow, just the woods standing there in the pale light, silent and still. I stayed in that house for another 3 weeks, but I never walked the dog at night again. Even during the day, I found myself glancing toward the tree-lean, half expecting to see those eyes staring back. I never did. The winter of 2023 was one of those seasons where the cold seemed to chew right through you. I was 17, restless, and stuck in that awkward space between still being treated like a kid and itching to prove I wasn't. School was a drag, life at home was stifling, and the only real relief was hanging out with my friends late at night when the whole town was dead quiet. That night there were 7 of us, me, Dylan, Julian, Logan, Josiah, Bobby, and Carlos. Bobby thought it was hilarious to carry a full-sized axe over his shoulder like some deranged lumberjack. We didn't have a plan beyond killing time and finding trouble. Earlier we'd gotten chased off school property by a janitor who clearly wasn't being paid enough to care, but also wasn't about to let a group of idiots climb the roof. We slipped into the woods, crunching over snow, joking about the frostbite we'd probably get before sunrise. Eventually, we wandered onto this narrow trail that wound down toward the ocean. The storm from a few days ago had left everything pristine, thick white snow covering the ground like an untouched bed sheet. It muffled every sound except the squeak of our boots. There was no wind, no cars, not even the distant hum of town. It felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath. That's when we saw it. The shed sat alone in a clearing at the end of the trail, half collapsed under the weight of years. Its once white paint had peeled away in ragged strips, leaving a mottled skin of gray wood and rust-colored streaks. The windows were fogged from the inside, cracked in the corners, and one of the shutters hung by a single hinge, creaking whenever the snow shifted on the roof. Of course, we had to check it out. Julian and I were the first to approach. I tugged at the door, but it barely budged, either locked or frozen solid. There was this heaviness in the air that wasn't quite fear yet, but enough to make the hairs on my arms stand up. Dylan came around to the side and spotted a sliding window, wedged halfway open. Without hesitation, he shoved it wider and slipped inside. Logan followed, then Josiah started climbing through, grunting as his jacket snagged on a nail. And then everything changed. Julian had turned toward the back of the clearing when he froze like a statue. I followed his gaze, and my stomach dropped. It stood just at the tree line. At first, my brain tried to make it a dog, because what else could it be? But no, it had the wrong proportions. Too tall, too narrow in the chest, the arms, or maybe legs, too long. Its skin was pale, stretched tight, and matted hair clung in wiry patches around its head. The ears were sharp and high like a Doberman's, but the eyes were dark pits, glossy but without reflection, swallowing the faint light instead of giving it back. It didn't move, didn't breathe, at least not that I could see. Just watched us. Julian's voice cracked, half laughing, half panicked. Is that a dog?" But I could hear the lie in his tone. Josiah had seen our faces and scrambled backward out the window, so fast he nearly tripped. Logan didn't even look. He just hurled himself through the same window like he was diving from a burning building, yelling, "Dude, that ain't no dog." Dylan, still halfway inside, started kicking like a trapped animal before deciding to push through the shed instead of the window. The old door burst outward with a groan, and he came tearing out, snow spraying behind him. We didn't wait to discuss it. We ran. The clearing exploded into chaos, boots slipping, snow flying, shouts mixing with nervous laughter. That's the thing about fear at 17. It often comes out as laughter, too loud and too sharp. Julian went down hard, face first into the snow, cursing. I stopped to grab him, but he scrambled up on his own, eyes wide and darting back toward the shed. And then he bolted past me. Not toward the trail. Past me, like he'd just seen something worse than before. His breath came in ragged bursts, and when I glanced back, I saw why. The thing had moved. It was closer now, standing where Julian had fallen. Still silent. Still watching. But its head tilted slightly, like it was studying how we moved. The panic hit me like a fist to the chest. I ran so hard my lungs burned, snow stinging my cheeks. Somewhere behind me, I could hear Bobby swearing under his breath and Carlos mumbling prayers. We regrouped at the tunnel under the bridge, a long, graffiti-coated cylinder that we'd claimed as a hideout in warmer months. Inside, our breath fogged the air, and the concrete smelled of mildew and stale beer from old summer parties. Dylan lit a cheap lighter, and the small flame seemed absurdly fragile against the dark. Logan's voice cut through the tension. "You're insane. Do you know what happens if that thing's filled with gas and you light it?" That sparked a fresh wave of swearing and scrambling, everyone shoving toward the other end of the tunnel. We spilled out into the night, breathless and rattled. By the time we reached Logan's house, the adrenaline had cooled just enough for the fear to settle in. Julian sat hunched on the couch, not speaking. Bobby and Carlos muttered about how maybe it was just a coyote with mange. But me and Dylan, we knew better. We'd seen the way it moved, too smooth for an animal, too silent for a person. And those eyes. A year later, in the summer of 2024, 4 of us went back, me, Julian, Bobby, and Carlos. The snow was gone, and the trail felt almost friendly in the daylight. But when we reached the clearing, the shed was different. It had been renovated, repainted, windows replaced, the roof repaired. Someone had claimed it again. The sagging walls were gone, the fogged glass replaced with clean panes that reflected the sky. But I swear, even under the bright sun, the space between the trees still felt wrong. I don't know what we saw that night. I just know it wasn't a dog. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm walking home alone, I swear I hear snow crunching behind me. Slow, deliberate, like it's keeping pace. I never thought I'd hear my father speak about anything supernatural. He wasn't that kind of man. My dad was as practical and no-nonsense as they came. Sharp-minded, loyal to his beliefs, and deeply suspicious of anything that couldn't be measured or weighed. He didn't believe in ghosts, demons, fortune-tellers, or miracle cures. If you told him you saw a UFO, he'd give you a polite nod and go right back to fixing the carburetor. But Yetis? That was different. The first time I realized this was about 5 years ago. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, talking about life in general. The conversation drifted toward strange stories we'd heard growing up, and I asked him point blank why he didn't believe in anything paranormal. He smirked, took a sip of tea, and said, "Because most of it is nonsense. People want to be scared. Makes them feel alive." And then I made the mistake of asking, "So you don't believe in Bigfoot either?" His expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. He leaned back in his chair, cleared his throat, and said, "That's different. The Yetis, they're real." I laughed. He didn't. Instead, he stared past me like he was looking through the years, back at something he'd tried to keep locked away. "You know," he said slowly, "I never told you what happened to me when I was stationed up north. Back in the late 1970s, during the Soviet era, my father served in the military. His unit was posted at a remote outpost called Sputnik, a cluster of barracks near the Russian-Norwegian border. If you look it up on an old map, You can still see some of the structures, weather-beaten skeletons now, half swallowed by forest. The place was isolated in every sense. Thick pine forests stretched for miles in all directions, broken only by icy rivers and bogs. In winter, the sun barely scraped above the horizon. The cold was the kind that worked its way into your bones and stayed there. One night, a group of 10 men, including my father, was assigned to make a supply run. The bulk of the equipment and munitions for the outpost were stored far from the main camp, deep in the woods, in a series of old warehouses left over from the early Cold War. These buildings were deliberately placed in hard-to-reach spots to avoid detection from above. The assignment was simple: drive out, load up, and be ready to return at first light. But the trip was slow from the start. The old military truck got a flat tire halfway down a dirt road, and it took nearly an hour to fix. By the time they reached the warehouses near a riverside town called Lazaro, the last of the twilight was gone. No one felt like unloading in the dark. The air was sharp and heavy, and they were bone-tired from the drive. Near the warehouses was a dugout shelter, nothing fancy, just a low wooden structure with a roof of packed sod, meant for quick overnight stays. They decided to crash there and tackle the work in the morning. Inside, it smelled faintly of damp earth and old wood. The floor was bare planks, rough and splintered in places. They spread out their bedrolls shoulder to shoulder, filling the small space wall to wall. The men spoke in low voices for a while, trading jokes and complaints, but gradually the chatter died out. That's when my dad noticed something strange. No one was asleep. Every man lay there with his eyes open, staring into the dimness. You could feel it in the air, an unease like a static charge before a lightning strike. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the forest outside felt wrong. My father described it as the sense of being observed from just beyond the reach of the darkness, something large and patient waiting for the right moment. Minutes stretched. The only sound was the wind moving through the pines. Then the wind stopped. That's when the footsteps began. They came from directly overhead, slow, deliberate thuds pressing into the sod roof. At first, they were light, testing the weight of the surface. Then they grew heavier, the beams above groaning under the strain. It wasn't the sound of a man. It wasn't hurried like a predator chasing prey. It was measured, purposeful, as if whoever, or whatever, it was knew they were listening. The thing paced from one end of the roof to the other, then circled back, each step vibrating faintly through the walls and floor. My father's heart was pounding so hard he thought the others could hear it. He wasn't alone. In the pale light from the single oil lamp, he could see the whites of the men's eyes, wide and fixed on the ceiling. One of them started breathing too fast, panic swelling inside him, until another soldier reached over and clamped a hand over his mouth. Then came the sound that still makes my dad's skin crawl when he talks about it, the slow, dragging scrape, as though something heavy was being pulled across the roof. Suddenly, one of the beams groaned loud enough to make them all flinch. They could feel it. Whatever was on the roof was enormous, its weight bending the structure under them. And then, without warning, it stopped. The men lay frozen, straining to hear over the rush of their own blood in their ears. A shadow moved past the single, grime-covered window. It was massive, so tall that, even crouched, its head nearly reached the top of the frame. In the dim light, all my dad could make out was a broad, sloping shape, thick with hair that bristled in the cold. The figure paused at the edge of the dugout, unmoving, watching. He couldn't see its eyes, but he could feel the weight of its gaze, like it was studying each man inside. They didn't breathe. Then, as silently as it had come, the figure moved away. No footsteps this time. Just gone. Eventually, exhaustion won out, though it was the shallow, restless kind of sleep that leaves you more tired than before. The next day, one of the men, bolder than the rest, spoke to a local villager about what they'd heard and seen. The old man barely reacted. He just nodded and muttered a word my father couldn't remember later. But he did remember the man's tone, flat, unsurprised, as though such things were simply part of life out there. This was the Soviet Union, a time when talk of spirits, monsters, or religion was officially discouraged, mocked even. The men in my father's unit were hardened soldiers, trained to face armed enemies, not shadows in the woods. None of them were the type to spook easily. Yet every one of them knew something had walked on that roof. Something huge. Something that wanted them to know it was there. My dad didn't tell my mother for decades. He only told me that one night, in the quiet kitchen, with the years sitting heavy on his shoulders. When he finished, he said, "You can believe what you want. I know what I heard. I know what I saw." He didn't raise his voice, didn't try to convince me. He just let the words hang there, the way a hunter leaves a snare set in the woods, waiting for you to stumble into it later. And stumble into it I did, because once you've heard a story like that from a man like him, it's impossible to stop imagining what might be out there, moving silently through the dark pines of the north. I grew up thinking my dad was the bravest man alive. Not the kind of bravado you see in movies, with grand speeches and chest beating, but the quiet, steady courage that comes from living close to the land. He was born in the backcountry of southern Missouri, raised among hills and hardwood forests, and had spent most of his life in places where help was an hour's drive, on a good day. He knew every tree, every slope, every trail within 20 miles of our home, and could tell you the season just by the smell of the air. He didn't go in for nonsense. If he couldn't hold it in his hands, if it didn't bleed when you shot it or change your tires when you asked, it wasn't worth arguing over. Ghosts? Fairy tales for people who didn't grow up working from sunup to sundown. Aliens? Maybe somewhere out there, but not here. And Bigfoot. The only big feat he cared about were on the men who could clear his fence line in a day. That's why I'll never forget the day he told me what happened that night in the summer of 1962. I was already grown, married, and had kids of my own by then. We were sitting out on his back porch after supper, just the two of us. The sky was bruising with the first shades of twilight, the cicadas buzzing their steady song, when out of nowhere he said, "There's something I never told you." His voice had that strange weight to it, the kind people get when they're about to say something that's been sitting on them for years. He told me it happened in August, during one of his late-night coon hunts. He and his friend, Raymond Ellis, were both in their early 20s and as comfortable in the woods as they were in their own kitchens. They'd hunted together more times than they could count, their dogs trained, so well they might as well have been part of the team. That night, they'd chosen a stretch of conservation land about 5 miles from the house. It was the kind of place most people passed right by without realizing how deep it went. Rolling ridges of oak and hickory, low meadows choked with summer grass, and a cold spring that cut through it all like a vein of glass. In the daytime, you'd see families spread out on the old picnic tables, kids splashing in the shallows of the spring. But at night, my dad said, the place changed. You could feel it, he told me. It's like the air would thicken, and everything that made it pretty in the day got swallowed up in shadow. They'd arrived just after sundown. The air was still and warm, the moon not yet risen. The dogs bounded out of the truck, tails high, their bells jingling softly in the dark. Dad and Raymond sat on the tailgate for a while, listening to the chorus of hounds as they worked the undergrowth. It didn't take long before the dogs struck a scent, their howls shifting to that urgent, rhythmic baying that meant they were on something's trail. The men followed, flashlights swinging in arcs over the tangled brush. It was thick going, but they knew the land well enough to move fast. About 15 minutes in, the dogs treed whatever they'd been chasing. The men caught up, leashed them, and gave them a quick pat on the side. Everything about the night felt routine up until that moment. Then my dad said the air changed. The first thing he noticed was the dogs. His lead hound, a scarred-up male named Duke who had chased raccoons into dens, fought off coyotes, and never once backed down, suddenly tucked his tail so far under his belly it nearly touched his chest. The other dogs went stiff, whining low in their throats. Duke started trembling, so hard the leash quivered in Dad's hand. Then, without warning, Duke wrenched free. Dad swore he'd never seen that dog run like that, not toward something, but away. He didn't make a sound except for this high, pitiful whimper that didn't belong in a dog his size. He tore off through the dark, brush snapping behind him, gone in seconds. That's when they heard it. It started low, so low that Dad felt it in his bones before he heard it in his ears. A growl, not the kind a bobcat makes, not the rumble of a bear, and nothing even remotely human. It was deeper, thicker, like it came from somewhere under the ground, and was vibrating its way up through their boots. And it didn't come from one place, it was everywhere at once. Raymond swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam caught only trees and shadow. Then came the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate, one after another, crunching over dead leaves and twigs. They weren't stumbling, and they weren't hurrying. Whatever it was circling them, close enough that they could feel the ground give just slightly with each step. Jesus Christ, Raymond muttered. What the hell is that? Dad didn't answer. He was too busy listening. And then, layered under the footsteps, came another sound, something like whispering. It was fast, erratic, like someone muttering to themselves in a language that wasn't meant to be understood. The cadence was all wrong for any animal. It stopped when they stopped, moved when they moved. Dad told me his instincts were screaming to run, but running blind in the dark with tangled brush and uneven ground was a good way to break your neck. So instead, he yanked out his revolver, aimed at the air, and fired twice. The gunshots rolled through the trees like thunder, and then nothing. No footsteps, no whispering, not even the hum of night insects. The kind of silence that presses on you until your ears start ringing. Raymond glanced at him, wide-eyed. "We're leaving." They didn't discuss it. They just moved. The walk back should have taken half an hour, maybe 40 minutes. But when they reached the truck, Duke was there, curled into a tight ball under the tailgate, still trembling. The other dogs clambered into the truck bed without being told, whining and pressing themselves against the cab. Dad climbed in, started the engine, and that's when he noticed the clock. Over 2 hours had passed. He swore up and down they hadn't taken a wrong turn, hadn't stopped except to shoot, and had walked the most direct route back. There was no way to explain it. When they got home, he didn't even tell my mom what happened. Just fed the dogs, washed his hands, and sat in his chair, pale as I'd ever seen him. It wasn't until years later, long after I'd moved out, that he told me the whole thing. And even then, his hands shook a little. "I don't know what was out there," he said, his eyes fixed on some point far away. "But I know this, it wasn't an animal I've ever hunted. And it wasn't a man. Whatever it wasn't afraid of us. Not of the guns, not of the dogs. It was awaiting, watching, and it wanted us to know it." I asked him once if he ever went back to that spot. He just shook his head and said, "No, some places don't belong to us." And that was the end of it.